Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Wednesday, April the 17th, 2024, and you are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for joining in. Oh, spring has sprung. We've had some absolutely glorious days here in Canada's national capital. A couple of really stinker days, but no snow, thank goodness, unlike some of our prairie provinces. And, you know, while I'm on the subject of the weather, I have to point out the incredible flooding that has hit some of the Arab countries in the eastern Middle East. The United Arab Emirates apparently had a rainfall in excess of anything that has been recorded for the last 75 years. And that, my friends, is all I'm going to talk about with regard to the Middle East tonight. I know you want me to get into a whole discussion about the attacks by Iran on Israel on the past weekend, but I'm not going to do it. Everybody else is talking about it. Everybody else is fixated on it, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm not interested. Of course I'm interested, and it's an important story, and I'm glad that there are people that are covering it. But there are other things going on in the world that need to be talked about, that need to be covered, and that's what I want to do. We're going to talk tonight about the budget here in Canada, the federal budget that was brought down just yesterday. There's a lot of ground to cover with respect to that. I want to take a bit of a different angle than what everybody else is talking about. Everybody's talking about, tax increases, tax cuts, all of the financial nitty-gritty. There are a few aspects of this that I want to delve into from a more principled point of view. But before we do that, first of all, housekeeping stuff. If you're joining us from the website, www.josephbenami.com, that's Joseph Ben-Ami, all one word, without the hyphen. If you look at the live player to the right, you will see the phone number that you can reach me at. It is no longer our toll-free number. We decided that we're not getting a lot of calls, so why continue to pay for a toll-free number when most people have long-distance plans anyway? So hopefully this won't impede anybody from calling. It won't discourage people from calling. But if you do want to call and you do want to participate in the discussion, then I would like for you to give me a call at 343-502 3121. So again, for those of you who are not listening on the internet, or perhaps you're listening on one of the internet stations that the Joseph Ben-Ami Show is carried on, and you're not actually looking at my show website, I will give you that number a few more times through the show. And if you get yourself a pencil, I'll even give it to you again in a couple of minutes before we get into the nitty-gritty of tonight's show. What else is happening? You can call me on Skype as well. So if you want to use your computer, log into your Skype account, and you can reach me at Joseph Ben-Ami. That's JOSEPHBENAMI. Just like josephbenami.com, all one word without the hyphen. And again, I'll give you the number, because I know you ran off to get your pencil and pad. Area code 343-502-3121. All right. As I said, we're going to talk about the budget here in Canada. And if you're not in Canada, if you're not Canadian, and we have an international audience, so obviously you may not be interested in the intricacies of the budget here in Canada, but when we do talk about it later on in the show, I want you to stay tuned in because we're going to be talking about some principle issues. And I don't mean principle financially. I mean principles as in values in terms of what we believe in. So, and some very important stuff I like to think. We will talk about some of the economic aspects of it, but I want to focus on a number of principle issues that I think are important to all of us, not just to those of us here in Canada, and that are applicable to all of us in Canada. But before we do that, yesterday and today, that's Tuesday and Wednesday, April the 16th and the 17th, there was a conference in Brussels, Belgium. Brussels, the capital city of Belgium. And, as it happens, the seat of the European Union is in Brussels. This conference was of conservative leaders, party senior party officials, some government officials. The Prime Minister of Hungary was participating in the conference, former cabinet ministers from Great Britain, etc., all from a conservative point of view. Now, some of the media, and this really burns me. I have to tell you, it drives me crazy when I read media reports of some of these occurrences, some of these issues, and the media reports these kinds of things as being, conferences as being hard right. And I'm really tired of the term hard right. Now, I'm not whining and complaining. You know what I like to say? Sticks and stones. You've heard me say that all the time. So I'm not offended by it, but I'm asking the simple intellectual question: what exactly does it mean to be hard right? I mean, the media, and of course the general population these days, these kinds of terminologies just sort of trickle off the tongue because we're so used to hearing them. But ultimately, really what it comes down to, I think, is what exactly is the hard right. And here's an interesting fact that you may not be aware of, but yours truly, has been characterized from time to time in the mainstream media as being a leader of Canada's alt-right. Now, to begin with, I'm happy, I guess, that people want to give me that kind of credit. Believe me, it's not deserved. I like to think of myself as somewhat of an influential voice in Canada's conservative movement, but a leader of the alt-right, I'm not even sure what that's supposed to mean. What exactly is the alt-right? I don't know. I mean, if you have some kind of a description of what it means to be alt-right, hey, I'm all ears. I'd be very happy to hear, but I just don't know what it means. So anyway, you open up your newspaper, or you turn on your television, your radio, or you open up your news app, which is more and more the way people get their news these days, and you're reading about this conference in Brussels of, hard right, the hard right conservative conference. Nothing of the sort, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody should be bamboozled by this kind of, foolish lazy journalistic rhetoric. Anyway, I just wanted to get that off my chest because I see this terminology all the time. And as I said, I don't get offended by these things. At least I don't take it personally. If I get offended, it's more on an intellectual basis. I find it intellectually offensive. Can I use that term? I don't personally feel like I'm being attacked by it, and if I was, I go, so what? As I said, sticks and stones. It doesn't bother me. But I do get bothered on a certain level. It offends my intelligence when I see and I hear this kind of mindless repetition of cliches and, that kind of thing. It does bother me. And it bothers me, I think, mostly because it kind of perpetuates some very foolish and, you know, what's the word I'm looking for here? Ignorant. Ignorant is the word I'm looking for. It perpetuates some very ignorant views about the political landscape that we live in. It's as if to say that anybody who doesn't toe the extreme left-wing line, and two can play that game, right? So the hard left. Anybody who's not towing the hard left line, the Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders line, somehow or other they're extremist right wings. Okay, what I'm going to say to you now is a subject for a whole different show that we're going to do in the not too distant future. We're going to have a nice talk about this in the very near future. And that is that there really, in this day and age, there really is no such thing as right wing and left wing. It's a mistake to characterize the intellectual ideas debate in terms of left wing and right wing. Now, everybody uses it, and I use it too from time to time, because it just so happens that is the way that people think about political differences. That's the way that they characterize them. It's the way they put them into a framework so that they can move them around in their mind and deal with them intellectually. But I have a better framework. My framework is very simple and very different. For me, it's not right wing versus left wing, because ultimately left wing, right wing, left wing, these terms they're vacuous. They're devoid of any meaning that is connected to the terminology. In other words, what does it mean to be right wing? If you want to call me conservative, well, there's a meaning to that, and there's a connection between the term conservative and what I believe in. But there's really no connection semantically between the term right wing and what I believe in, or right wing and conservative. So let me offer to you an alternative framework that I think is far better at characterizing the ideological debate that goes on today in politics and largely throughout society. It's not about left wing and right wing. And it may be between liberal and conservative. We could have a chat about that. But it's really more about statism, that is to say, government control over everything, the state, versus individuals. That's really what the divide is. The divide is between those of us who believe in individual liberty, individual responsibility, and those who believe in government responsibility. I don't want to say government liberty. That's probably a stretch a bridge too far. But certainly looking to the state to lead, looking to the state to run things, and relying on the state to provide what you and I as individuals probably can and should be providing our fellow human beings, ourselves as individuals, or maybe voluntarily through, collectively through voluntary organizations. What Edmund Burke used to refer to as the small platoons of society, or words to that effect. So it's really about statism or collectivism versus individuality, or individual rights, individual freedom. That's really what it comes down to. Now, this is a bigger discussion, and we really should dedicate a whole show to it. I think that's an important thing to do. So we will, pay attention. It may be a few weeks down the road, but we're going to dedicate a whole evening to this debate. One more thing that I want to say on this, and that is that the outcome of the framework that I've just presented to you is that, in fact, fascism and communism are really more or less the same thing. Now, I know that there are people out there that are going to scream. I can just visualize you pulling your hair out. But bear with me when I explain why I'm saying this. I'm saying this because when you think about it, whether you believe, as communists do, in no private ownership, or you believe as fascists, I should say, do, and you believe in private ownership. I mean, that is a distinction between fascism and communism. One believes in public ownership, one believes in private ownership to a degree. But it doesn't matter who holds the title deed to the property, as in under fascism, if the government is directing your entire life. If the government, in fact, is directing what you do and don't do commercially with your private business. So, as a practical matter, there really isn't that much difference between communism and fascism. The only other difference that I would perhaps point out is that communism tends to be much more international, whereas fascism tends to be much more nationalist. Okay, but that's not a significant difference. In terms of political systems, communism is really a branch of fascism, or you might say that fascism is a branch of communism. Now, what you need to do is you need to make note of this, and then you need to go away and you really need to digest it. And don't reject the concept out of hand. I know you probably haven't heard this before, but I think it's an extremely important point to make, and it's apropos to this whole left-wing, right-wing business. The whole thing about fascism and communism is that they are both collectivist, statist ideologies. And that's the essence of what they are. The government, the state, decides. The state rules over you as an individual rather than you individually, along with the rest of your neighbors, your citizens of the country, ruling over the government. So these are the kinds of things that are being discussed at conferences, such as the one that I described that was being held yesterday and today in Brussels. Now, why am I raising the issue of this particular conference? Well, because the mayor of Brussels, apparently not liking this gathering of the far right, the hard right in my city, ordered the police to shut the conference down. Now, I want just think about that for a second. Belgium is not a dictatorship. Belgium is what we would characterize as certainly one of our allies in NATO, a Western liberal democracy. And I mean liberal in terms of the classic sense, not, the ideological liberalism of today. So how do you reconcile the mayor of this ostensibly free country? How do you reconcile the idea of the mayor, having the power? Okay, just for a second, forget about the fact that he wants this conference shut down. But can the mayor simply call up the police commissioner and say, out of the blue, hey, I don't like these guys, let's send the cops in and shut that conference down. We don't want them talking or anything like that. They're hard right. Okay. How is it that the mayor thinks that they have the power to do that? And what is it with the police leadership that they sort of, figuratively speaking, I assume figuratively, salute the mayor, say, yes, sir, and, off they go? Those are big questions. I think Belgians that is to say citizens of Belgium, subjects, I guess, is better because it is a constitutional monarchy in Belgium, really need to demand answers to from their government. Now, in the end, in fairness, in the end, the Prime Minister of Belgium pointed out that the mayor had no constitutional authority to order the conference to be shut down. And in the end, it wasn't. Well, it was kind of funny because yesterday, Tuesday, the police did enter the premises. They did tell the organizers that the conference had to be shut down. They did prevent people from entering, and when people left the conference, they did prevent them from re-entering. But they didn't actually storm in and shut the conference down, which is kind of bizarre. I find that really hard to understand exactly what it is that they were trying to achieve this way. So very, very bizarre, very strange. But I have a couple of clips. I want to play. I'm going to play. I'll save a couple of them for after the break. But before the break, let's play just the reaction of one of the organizers of the conference as he is on the podium and he is announcing this situation, that the police have informed him now that they want to shut the conference down. So he's making an announcement and outlining to the audience exactly what the circumstances are, what's expected of them, and have a listen.
What's happening is that Brussels police have an order to close down the event. Please don't get up yet. To close down the event because we are creating a public disturbance. However, they only sent 3 police officers. And so when the police walked in and all the cameras turned on them, they got scared and they went back outside. So I'll tell you where the negotiations stand. At the moment, the police are saying that the event is creating public disturbance and therefore it will be closed down gradually. The way that's going to work is you can all stay here as long as you want for the time being, but if you walk out of the building, they're not going to let you back in. So I invite you to stay with us for as long as the festivities go on. If by some chance there's a decision to apply greater force to shutting us down, then I can assure you that we will continue tomorrow morning at a different venue. So for the time being, let's just go on. Thank
you. Isn't that just I don't know, does bizarre really capture the essence of that situation? So the mayor orders the conference to be shut down. The police are dispatched to shut the conference down, but they only send 3 police officers in. Now, the fact that they only send 3 police officers in ought to tell you something. What it ought to be telling you is that the police did not expect any kind of violence, any kind of physical pushback, any kind of real resistance. In other words, they just figured this is a conservative conference, and conservatives are generally decent, law-abiding citizens. So all we have to do is go in and say, you've been ordered shut down, and they'll shrug their shoulders and say, oh, woe is me. How could you do such a terrible thing? But I guess I have to follow it because it's a lawful order. Presumably, you would assume that the police in Brussels are executing a lawful order. Turns out that the order was not lawful in the first place. It was unconstitutional, as the Prime Minister pointed out, the Belgian Prime Minister. But isn't it funny that you're worried about this hard right extremist gathering in the heart of Brussels? It's so dangerous. We must shut this down. This is they're creating some sort of a public disruption. Send the police. Send the police. So the police go with 3 officers. 3 officers, and they just walk in and they politely ask people to end the conference because why? Well, because you're creating a public nuisance. These guys must be taking their cues from the authorities here in Canada, who are still prosecuting 2 years after the fact organizers of the peaceful convoy, Freedom Convoy, here in Ottawa, where I live. I can give you eyewitness accounts myself. I was there. I can vouch for anybody. If you want to know what happened, peaceful. It was peaceful. Okay, we got a little noisy when the truckers were honking their horns. But, that's a protest, right? And maybe it wasn't pleasant. And maybe you could argue that was some form of public mischief. But it seems pretty innocuous to me, all things considered. I mean, when you stack it up against other protests, the kinds of things that have been going on since October the 7th on the streets here in North America and in Europe and in various cities across the globe, honking your horns, it just doesn't cut it for me. Nevertheless, we're still prosecuting people as if it was like some mass murder that was committed by them. That maybe they blew up buildings, set fires. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's Antifa. But even the Antifa people don't find themselves in court a year or 2 years or 3 years after their demonstrations, after the looting that went on, etc. But here in Canada, we continue to prosecute the alleged leaders, some of the alleged leaders of the protest, of the Freedom Convoy, on the grounds that, it's public mischief. You committed public mischief. And we are going to prosecute you to the furthest extent of the law and beyond. So maybe that was the way that the authorities were thinking in Belgium. They're looking at our leadership here in Canada. They're going, wow, if those Canadians could do it, so can we. Let's send the police in. So they send 3 officers. Clearly, they didn't expect trouble. Clearly, the authorities didn't believe that these guys were troublemakers. To me, that is absolutely obvious. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the bottom of the hour, so we are going to take our first break for this evening. When we come back, I have more clips to play, reaction to the situation in Belgium. So stay put. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thank you for staying with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Banami Show. Let's see. For Wednesday, April the 17th, 2024, I am your host, Joseph Banami. Okay, we've been talking about this situation in Brussels and this conference of Conservative Party activists and leaders that was being held in Brussels, in Belgium. Conservative Party activists and leaders from across Europe, former government officials, some religious officials, and some media personalities, what I would characterize as media personalities, and the fact that the not the Belgian government, but the Brussels government saw fit to arbitrarily decide that they were going to shut this conference down. And so they sent police, and as I was mentioning before the break, that they obviously didn't expect any kind of serious pushback or trouble from the participants of the conference, because the police only sent 3 officers, and when the officers came in and they saw that somebody was videotaping them or whatever, they quickly turned around and left. Now, if you look at video of the conference outside, there are more than 3 officers. What they did was they formed some sort of a cordon around the entrance to the venue from yesterday, Tuesday, and their tactic was very simple. They basically wouldn't let anyone new into the auditorium. For those who were there already, they were allowed to stay. They were not removed. The conference was not shut down, but people who wanted to enter later in the day were prevented from entering, and anyone who left the conference for whatever reason was prevented from re-entering. So there is a cordon, a number of police, I don't know how many, but from the videos I saw, at least a dozen, perhaps more, police officers there to enforce that part of the ban, okay, or that part of the tactic to quote-unquote shut this conference down. But in terms of actually going in and quote-unquote confronting the participants of the conference, well, they only sent 3 officers in, and then they didn't try to shut the conference down. Now, what they did do is they did try to prevent the conference from reconvening today, Wednesday, the next day. And so that's a problem. And I have a couple of clips addressing, that and a couple of other related issues. Some information from Nigel Farage, who was one of the keynote speakers. Now, for those of you who don't know, Nigel Farage is a British politician, although he's not really active in politics anymore, but he was probably the leader of the Brexit forces, the Brexit voters in the United Kingdom during the Brexit debate. That is to say, the debate over whether or not the UK would remain a part of the European Union. And of course, they had a referendum, and UK citizens voted to leave the EU, and Nigel Farage was probably the number one spokesperson pushing for that departure. Before I play the clip, let me just reiterate again, if you want to call, we have a new phone number. It's area code 343-502-3121. The number again, 343-502-3121. That is a number here in Canada's national capital. And just so that you understand, it's not toll-free. We've decided to, do away with the expense of maintaining a toll-free number, and just stick with a regular number. And also, you can reach the show if you want to participate. If you have any opinion, you think I'm off base, you have information to share, whatever, all you have to do is you can contact the show by Skype. The username is Joseph Benamy, all one word without the hyphen, which is very similar to the website, josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. Okay, so now that I got that housekeeping out of the way, let's go to Nigel Farage, I should say, speaking to the media about the situation at the conference in Belgium. So this is clip number 2.
That meeting, over the next 2 days, you've got the Prime Minister of Hungary, you've got a bishop, you've got members of the European royal families coming, well-known international businessmen and women, politicians, leaders of parties that will win European elections in countries this year, in June, and yet, because they're questioning ever closer union, because they're questioning globalism, they're literally being shut down. This is like the old Soviet Union. No alternative view allowed. I tell you what, I might have had my reservations about the way the Conservative government have carried out Brexit. If anything convinced me we did the right thing, it was what happened in that place this morning.
So I'm going to take issue with Nigel Farage on one point. I think mistakenly characterizes what the authorities have done in Belgium as sort of similar to what the communists used to do in the former Soviet Union. And I don't think he's wrong about that, but I think he misses a point. He misses an opportunity to make an important point that we were just discussing prior to the break earlier on in the show, which is why I wanted to bring it up at that time. And that is that if it's me, I think that if I'm speaking to the media, I think that I would prefer to characterize what the authorities in Belgium did vis-a-vis this conference as being more in line with what the National Socialists would do, the fascists would do in Germany. Now, I know, again, there are people out there that are going, oh, you know, fascists. Look, there's very little difference. In fact, I think virtually no difference in practice, except for there might be some economic differences, there might be some focus differences, but in terms of the statism, in terms of the thuggishness, in terms of the tyranny exercised by the National Socialists in Germany or the communists in the Soviet Union and their followers wherever they were globally, in terms of that, you know, they're the same. And I actually think that the criticism characterizing what the government did in Belgium vis-a-vis this conference as being Nazi-like is far more provocative than characterizing them as being communist. So in that respect, I think that Nigel missed an opportunity to make a very important point. And in fairness, I've never talked to him about this, so I don't know whether or not what his views are on this particular subject. But I cannot say this strongly enough. If you followed my writing and if you follow my show, you know from time to time, whenever this subject comes up, I never let the opportunity pass without pointing out that the lessons of 1930s Germany and the Nazis is not what happens when you allow free speech and the promotion of hatred. And, you know, I'm not defending Nazis. Of course, they were promoting hatred, and it was horrendous and, grotesque and, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but it was just wrong. Unacceptable. And that kind of promotion of hate and et cetera is unacceptable in any society. It's unacceptable then. It's unacceptable now. I'm not defending the content of the speech. I'm pointing out that there is no credible evidence to sustain the argument that the Nazis benefited electorally prior to having come to power by this rhetoric. There's no evidence to suggest, to support the assertion that anti-Semitism helped the Nazi Party in its electoral efforts. If anything, it's far more plausible to say that it probably undermined their electoral success. So, what is the point I'm making? The point I'm making is that it's shutting down freedom of speech, which is what the Nazis did after they came to power, thereby silencing opposition to them. That was the key to their success, or a key to their success, if I could use the term success in relation to the Nazis. It's shutting down, preventing open debate. That, ladies and gentlemen, is far more dangerous than allowing people to speak hatefully. And again, I'm not defending hate speech. It exists, and I'm against it. But at least, thank goodness, I live in an environment where I'm able to speak out against it. If you want to say, Jews are evil because they're Jews, that's just an evil thing. Well, okay, say it, but at least I live in a society where I have the freedom to come back and say, you're a kook. You're an idiot. You're a blockhead. You're a fool. Under the Nazis, I could never say that. And as a consequence, the only message that especially younger and impressionable minds were getting filled with was the anti-Semitic rubbish. They were never getting the other side of the story. And as a consequence, the Nazis did, I think, succeed, again, I use the term loosely, in creating more or less a general anti-Semitic attitude within German society during that time, especially amongst younger people. But what do you expect? They weren't getting anything else. They weren't hearing anything else. So again, free speech is critically important to countering hate speech. When you control hate speech, you are essentially adapting Nazi tactics to your own advantage. And sure, 100% the intent is purely benevolent. But what happens when your opponents start to use the mechanisms and the justifications for shutting down free speech malevolently rather than benevolently? And I think we see a perfect example of it here in Belgium this week, vis-a-vis this conference, where you have mild-mannered people who simply want to talk about their concerns about expanding powers of the European Union, among other similar topics. That's all they want to do. They want to talk about these things. And they're political leaders, community leaders. And the mayor of Belgium, not the mayor of Belgium, but the mayor of Brussels, who disagrees with the political agenda of this conservative gathering, particularly, I'm assuming, vis-a-vis the continued growth and strengthening of the EU bureaucracy. And so he orders the police to step in and shut the conference down, which is exactly what the Nazis did in the 1930s and in the lead up to their taking power, where they would send their thugs in. And again, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the Brussels police. I am very impressed with the fact that they were very mild-mannered and easygoing about this whole confrontation, okay? So I would never accuse them of Nazi tactics in fulfilling the orders of their government, of their mayor, but I cannot, it doesn't change the fact that just the mere fact that they were trying to shut down a conference, albeit peacefully trying to shut down a conference, doesn't change the fact that they were trying to shut down the conference, and that is what Nazis used to do to their political opponents. There's no escaping that, and it's really uncomfortable. But there's no getting away from that, and there's no real sense in pretending that it isn't the case. And when I bring this up, when I say this, I don't mean to offend people, but I'm not going to allow my feelings of not wanting to offend people to dictate to me that I'm going to turn a blind eye to what I consider to be dictatorial practices, irrespective of whether the government was elected through democratic means or not. I have a clip here, a second clip of Nigel Farage addressing the audience at the conference subsequent to all of this, and talking about the effort by the government to find ways to block them from moving the conference to a different venue in order to keep it going. So let's listen to this clip number 2.
I knew I wouldn't be welcome back in Brussels. And having one venue cancel, well, okay, I can live with that. But for 2 venues to cancel is absolutely outrageous. And what you may or may not know in the audience now is that this venue, which accepted this booking last night, and we give huge thanks to the Tunisian owner of this business for his courage in allowing free speech to take place. But what is happening as we speak is he is receiving phone calls from the local mayor. The police are being encouraged to come in and shut down this conference. They have even been speaking to the caterers. So the food hasn't arrived.
Just want to pause. I just pause the clip for a second because I want to make sure you heard that correctly. That they've even been trying to convince the caterers not to provide food to the participants of this conference. That is the extent to which the Brussels government went to try to silence the participants of this conference. Really quite outrageous.
The plates haven't arrived. Worst of all, the drinks haven't arrived. But I shouldn't make a joke of it, because they have told this Tunisian owner, who believes in free speech, that if he carries on with this conference, they'll make sure he goes out of business. His wife is being threatened. This is what we're up against.
Quite outrageous. Quite outrageous. Now, Nigel Farage and I do not see eye to eye on several things. This isn't the time or the place to elucidate, to elaborate on that. But on this, he's spot on. He's spot on. And anybody, whether you're, I hesitate to use the terms left wing, right wing after everything that I've said on today's show so far, but whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're a liberal or conservative, you should be very deeply concerned. Deeply concerned. Not just that this happened, but that it happened in the seat of the European Union, the capital city of Belgium, which is arguably one of the most liberal countries and societies on the planet. And I don't know what the repercussions are going to be of these the actions taken by the mayor. And again, I have to say, as impressed as I am with the restraint and the good behavior of the police rank and file, the officers on the spot, it's really quite outrageous that the head of the police in Brussels would simply take these instructions from the mayor. I think it ought to be obvious that trying to stop a conference of senior political leaders from different countries discussing what is really of a legitimate, and one might even say innocuous subject, like how do we limit the power of the bureaucracy in the EU? I mean, this is a debate that goes on domestically in every country. I would expect. Certainly it goes on here in Canada. I know it goes on in the United States, goes on in the UK, and I would expect that it goes on in most European countries. Are we happy with the bureaucracy? Is the bureaucracy too powerful, too cumbersome, to the extent that it's no longer providing the services adequately that we're paying taxes for it to provide? That is a perfectly legitimate debate to have. To characterize that as somehow rather far right, okay, to demonize the participants for having the temerity to question the efficacy of a bloated bureaucracy such as we see in the in the European Union, to characterize that as far right, and not only to vilify its participants in a conference, in a discussion such as this, but to actually go out of your way to try to prevent them from meeting and discussing these subjects in an open forum. It's for want of a better term, it's a firing offense. The mayor of Brussels should be fired by the voters of Brussels for having taken this extraordinary action. And quite frankly, I have to say, again, I'm impressed with the rank and file officers that were on the spot. They must have felt that they were in a difficult position, and I think they handled themselves with professionalism and, dare I even say, a healthy dose of decorum. I have nothing to say bad about what I have heard or seen of the actions of the Belgian and Brussels police in this particular circumstance. But shouldn't people be outraged with the acquiescence of the police leadership in ordering his men to take this action, knowing, as he must have known, that the orders he was receiving from the mayor were, at a minimum, questionable. At a minimum, questionable. And I would have expected, if I'm in that individual's shoes and the mayor is ordering me to take this action, I probably would, first of all, I would probably push back. And if the mayor insisted, I'd probably seek outside counsel before I went ahead and executed that order. Did the police commissioner or the head of the police take that kind of action prior to ordering his force to intervene and impose their views on the conference participants? I don't know. Perhaps he did, and perhaps he got advice that he had no choice but to follow those orders. But it's just hard for me to wrap my mind around the thought that nobody raised any kind of significant objections. In any event, the conference is now ended, and what I'm going to do this week, I'm going to reach out, I expect, to the organizers of the conference and maybe get a little bit more background information that we could provide to you, our listeners, next week, or maybe post some information on the website in order to keep you informed as to what the outcomes were of this really quite sad episode in Brussels, Belgium. All right, so let's see. I'm looking at the clock, and I see that we're coming up to the top of the hour. So when we come back, ladies and gentlemen, after the break, we're going to start to discuss and unpack the federal budget that was brought down here in Canada yesterday. And I have some interesting discussion points on this that don't necessarily pertain exclusively to Canada's budget, that are a little bit more principle focused. So if you don't live in Canada, you should still stay with us, because I think that you'll enjoy the subjects that we want to cover, and you may even find them a little bit informative. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back here in a little bit more than 2 minutes on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Please do not go away. And we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, April the 17th, 2024. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. I don't know why I'm speaking so mechanically. Okay, so the number to call if you want to participate in the discussion is 343-502-3121. The number again, 343-502-3141. Or alternatively, if you're at your computer and you have a Skype account, and you can get a free Skype account, and I'm not paid by Microsoft, so this is not meant to be paid advertising, but, I have to tell you, if your experience with Skype previously was poor, in the last little while, the quality has been really quite outstanding. So, I've used Zoom from time to time, but I find that the limitation in particular in terms of the amount of time you can spend on a Zoom call, it's unfortunate. I don't know if they're going to be removing that limit at some point in time. Anyway, Zoom, but the quality of Zoom is good too, so I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but, I'm just saying that if you're on your computer, you can download Skype for free, and you can use it for free, making Skype calls. If you're going to start using it to, make calls to landlines or cell phones, well, there is a subscription service that you have to pay for that. But in terms of calling people using the Skype system itself and bypassing phones altogether, it's actually pretty good. And, while I'm on this subject, and I want to get to the topic in a second, but I'm also going to tell you, and this is not a paid advertisement, but the last couple of days I've done a handful of international calls using WhatsApp. Again, WhatsApp is a free service. You just download it, and you can send messages, chat back and forth, have group chats, etc. But you can also make phone calls using it. Again, the phone call would be through Wi-Fi or through your data rather than through the normal telephone system, but it's pretty good. The quality that I had was, frankly, I thought it was astonishingly good. That's WhatsApp. So, those are just a couple of the services that I've used. So I'm, giving a shout out to the developers on them. But it's probable, it's possible and maybe even probable that there are other services out there that are as efficient and the quality is just as good. But these are just a couple that I was using recently. So, how did I get onto this subject? Right. So if you want to call me using Skype, participate in the call using Skype, the username for the Joseph Benamy Show is, of course, just me, Joseph Benamy, all one word, without the hyphen, which is very similar to, not just similar, but identical to the domain name for the website, josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. So again, telephone number 343-502-3141, and the Skype ID, if you want to use that, Joseph Benamy, JosepHBenami, Joseph Benamy, all one word, without the hyphen. That is the name that you should use in making your Skype call. All right, so we spent quite a bit of time the first hour talking about this situation in Belgium. And now I want to just switch over to a different topic. I promised we'd spend some time talking about the latest federal budget that was brought down here in Canada yesterday. And there are a number of items that I want to touch on that this budget touches on. And some of them are, pertain more specifically to Canada, but there are a number of principles surrounding this budget that I think are worth discussing, even if you're not from Canada, and that are applicable to other situations outside of this country. So I think that the biggest takeaway from this budget, there are a couple of takeaways. The first is, here we are. If I could use the term socialist, I use the term socialist and socialism sparingly because it's one of those things that has almost lost all meaning. We accuse people of, they're socialists. They're trying to make a socialist country. Well, having said that, there is a meaning to it, and Canada has been engaged for, a few decades in what I would call a gradual march towards a socialist government, a truly socialist government. In the last few years, that slow march has turned into a mad dash, particularly in the last year. Now, it could be because the Trudeau government is astonishingly unpopular in Canada, which is funny because when you think about how Justin Trudeau was welcomed as the next generation of enlightened progressive leadership, not just in Canada but in the world. When he was first elected in 2015, I mean, he was a rock star. People couldn't stop celebrating the emergence of Justin Trudeau as a leader on the political scene, on the world scene. He was going around from country to country, and the media loved him. The progressives in the various countries he was visiting loved him. That shine quickly dissipated. He shot himself in the foot a few times on some issues. I like one of the big ones was when he gave an interview. I don't recall what the media outlet was. It was an American media outlet where he was singing the praises of Canada and pointing out that Canada was the world's first post-national, how did he put it? Post-national state. When he said it, he said it in all seriousness. He truly believed it. I don't know whether he believes it anymore, but he was referring to Canada's so-called multicultural society. And there's a subject that we're going to have to spend some time unpacking and talking about in the not too distant future. But I digress. The subject that Justin was talking about at the time was that, I suspect. And he was singing the praises of his country, basically saying, look at us, look at this country I'm leading. We are multicultural. We are the world's first multinational state. And when I and my colleagues here first heard that, we looked at one another and we said, well, that's probably news to our friends in the United Kingdom, which has been a multinational state for, centuries. So clearly our prime minister was, I don't know what he was smoking that day, and I suspect that he smokes something, a little of the funny stuff there from time to time, particularly now that it's legal in Canada. So the point is the shine was off the prime minister very quickly, I think, and his handling of the Freedom Convoy and the invocation of the Emergencies Act to break up that protest was really not welcomed on the international scene. He paid, I think, a significant price in terms of his reputation and a damage to his reputation in taking the action that he did at that time, or that his government took. In any event, this lack of popularity of the Liberal government here in Canada, I think, is a good explanation as to why all of a sudden we seem to have this incredible acceleration in what I call the march to a socialist government in Canada. And hence, it's no longer just a slow march. It's not even a quick march. It's not even double time. It is a mad dash, a sprint to the finish line. So as you all know, if you follow Canadian politics, in Canada, we have a healthcare system. We have a universal, single-payer, publicly owned and operated healthcare system here in Canada. And I want to get into some of the challenges around that particular system. But before I do, let me point out to you that in the last few years, we started off with healthcare, which has been around now for decades. And our healthcare system has some problems in it. We're going to get into that very soon. But the next thing we know is we have to have in Canada a national pharmacare program, and then a national dental care program, a national daycare program, and the latest now is a national school lunch program. All of these things, to one degree or another, replicating, not in essence today, our healthcare system, but certainly following the steps of the founders of our healthcare system. So the problems that we have in our healthcare system aren't showing up yet in any of these other systems that are now being implemented. But they will. And again, as I said, we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But this budget increases spending by some $50 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot in terms of other countries, but I think that people have to understand, including here in Canada, that we are a pretty small country population-wise. We've only just broken the 40 million mark in terms of population. And that surprises people when I tell them that, including a lot of Canadians who think that our country is a lot more populated than that, particularly given its immense size. But it's not. We are one of the, I know people don't agree with me on this, but I think we're one of the great underpopulated countries of the world. So to increase our spending by, tens of billions of dollars in order to fund these and similar programs, that is an incredibly large increase in spending. Okay, so, that's sort of the Canadian, part of the Canadian aspect to it. One of the other aspects that, if I want to just talk about something that's pertains explicitly to Canada, and that is the fact that we've increased the spending by this much, and we're operating at a $40 billion deficit, almost $40 billion, ever so slightly less than 40, 39 point something. So our deficit, federal deficit, now is at $40 billion. And again, doesn't sound like much, especially if you're in the United States, where the debt is in the trillions of dollars and the deficit is in at least the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not pushing $1 trillion. So it's a big deal here in Canada. We don't have the kind of tax base, the kind of revenue that could sustain this kind of spending for very long. Nonetheless, we have a government that is committed to the implementation of these programs that are meant ostensibly to alleviate the constraints that people are under financially. People are being squeezed by the cost of living increase, inflation, food prices are up here, etc. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time pointing out that the reason that our prices have a big reason, not the only, but a big reason why prices for consumers have been going up so much is the increase in taxes, particularly the carbon tax, so-called carbon tax, which is meant to discourage people from using fossil fuels by making the fossil fuels more expensive. And I don't know, there's so many problems with that. But again, I don't think I'm going to talk too much about that tonight. What I want to talk about, I think, focus on right now is the whole idea of whether or not it's appropriate for the government to step in and to create programs, social programs in particular I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about the government paying for police or paying for the military. And I'm not even talking about the government providing some sort of financial support to those in our society who require it. A social safety net, if you want to call it that. I think that's a good term to use. But providing a social safety net should not and does not mean that you actually have to provide the social services that come along with the social safety net. Unfortunately, we in Canada have bought into this myth that somehow if the government isn't providing the service, that the service isn't going to be provided. And so this is the genesis of healthcare. What started off as I think, not a bad idea amongst some of the provinces here in Canada to reduce the costs to patients of inpatient hospital care has morphed into this incredible, colossal bureaucracy that more and more is not able to provide the basic medical services that we pay for through our taxes, but still can't keep the costs under control. And my argument is that that is actually the inevitable outcome of all government social programs. We have a situation here in Canada where, and there are a lot of people out there that think that we have the best healthcare system in the world, including a lot of Canadians who, to be perfectly blunt, have no experience of healthcare outside of Canada, and so therefore, they're able to swallow gullibly the myth that is perpetuated by our governments, successive governments, both conservative and liberal, that we are blessed with one of, if not the best healthcare systems in the world. And in fairness, if you happen to be in a car accident or you happen to have a heart attack or whatever, something that requires acute care, you're going to get it. You're going to get world-class health care, acute care, in a good, relatively clean, modern, sophisticated hospital, and you're not going to pay bills for that. So you're not going to go bankrupt because you were in a car accident. You're not going to be booted out of a particular hospital because your insurance ran out. You're not going to have any of those problems. So for acute care, it's a good system financially, and the quality of the service you get, the quality of the healthcare, is pretty good as well. It may not be at the top of the world, at the cutting edge of medical technology and know-how in most cases, in many cases, but it's still pretty damn good. The problem, of course, is that if you have chronic care or you require chronic care, then that care is rationed. Now, we don't like to talk about it being rationed. That's a dirty word, but it's the reality. And the reality, the reason it's the reality is because, follow the logic on this, ladies and gentlemen. You start off with a system, you started off with a system to reasonably provide some coverage out of the public purse for individuals who were receiving inpatient care in hospitals. But eventually what happened is we expanded that coverage and then kicked in this principle of universality at the same time that we were stopping and then we banned extra billing, and what ends up happening is you create a demand unlimited demand for healthcare services because you've detached entirely the consumer of healthcare, which is what patients are in the first place, from the cost of their consumption. So you've created this unlimited demand, which is going to push prices up. But because you're a single payer, and because there's no market forces involved, the only way that you can control costs is to cap them. Well, the only way that you can cap costs, there are only two things you can do to cap costs, and that is to ration the services, which leads to long waiting lines. Now, again, we don't call it rationing here, but that's precisely what it is. Or you limit the amount of money that healthcare providers, that is to say doctors, can charge the system or be reimbursed by the system in the process of providing healthcare. And so that discourages people from getting into the healthcare field. And we have a shortage of doctors and nurses here, principally because it's really hard to make a good living as a doctor now in Canada. And on top of that, because billing outside of the system, that is to say private billing, that if I'm a doctor, you call me in the middle of the night, I come and see you at your home. I don't know if there are any doctors that actually do that anymore. They used to when I was a child, but I don't know if they do it anymore. But let's say they did do that. Should a doctor then bill that patient for something extra, a home visit as opposed to an in-office visit, for instance? Well, extra billing of all kinds is just illegal now in Canada. You can't do that. And so doctors literally cannot make ends meet in some cases because of the rules that they have to follow. And so people are not getting into the medical profession here. Now, there is an element of government determining how many spaces we have in universities in medical schools. Again, nonsense that they should be doing it. It's rubbish, but they're doing it, and that contributes to the problem. But you see what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen. You start off with a situation where you're quite nicely, quite rightly, for all the best of intentions, providing a service, and healthcare is what I'm using to illustrate the problem, but it could just as easily be daycare, for instance. We start off saying we want to help parents to be able to afford daycare. So what are we going to do? We're now going to create a daycare system. We are going to create a system that parents, we call it $10 a day daycare. So parents that may have been paying hundreds of dollars, not $10 a day, but whatever it is, I can't remember now. They may have been paying, hundreds of dollars for daycare services, but now they can have the government pay for those services, and they just pay $10 for it, or whatever the rate is. And so the private daycare providers get squeezed out of the business because everybody wants to have the cheap daycare. Why wouldn't you? And because there's this bad rush for cheap daycare, now what you end up having is a situation where there's again an unlimited demand on the government program. And so you either now have to ration that, or you can just throw the doors open and say, okay, we're just going to continue to expand daycare spaces, which just makes the program more and more and more expensive. And now you have to find the tax revenue in order to pay for that program. So that's kind of where we're at now. Certainly that's where we're at with healthcare, and we're very closely approaching that now with some of these other programs, and it won't take long for us to reach them. All right, so you understand what I'm saying. Maybe I'm being a little bit convoluted, and I apologize for that. I don't mean to be, but the point I'm making here is that that vicious circle, that cycle of creating unlimited demand at the same time that you're being forced to cap the supply, it creates this situation where you have this ongoing growth in the cost, but nothing out there to regulate the consumption. And so you end up providing mediocre services, fewer and fewer services, for the tax dollars that people are paying for those services. Hence, what I call rationing. Again, we don't like to call it rationing in Canada, but that's certainly what we're doing. But you cannot run a social program through the government without running into these problems. You may not run into them right away. You may not run into them at the front end. Things might appear to be operating well, but eventually this is what happens. More and more people are going to enter the system because it's cheaper, if not free, or the appearance of free, and that's just going to drive costs up. And of course, the only way to cover those costs is to raise taxes, and raising taxes, all it does is it puts more financial pressure on the people that you were trying to help in the first place. And more, you create, even on that side, greater demand for the service because people's day-to-day lives are being squeezed. They're being squeezed by higher taxes. So it's this vicious circle of catch-22. And it's inherent in every government-run social program. Every entitlement program that is run by the government, where the service is provided by the government, you end up with this problem. Okay, just looking at the clock, we're going to take our final break for the evening, so stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. More on this subject when we come back here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. The 9 most feared words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That was a famous quote by Ronald Reagan, who pointed out that in our current circumstances, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And I couldn't agree more. You know, just one final word specifically pertaining to Canada's healthcare system. You know, people think that you could just raise taxes. Well, they go, well, raise the taxes, raise taxes on the rich. Well, in this country, the rich are already paying more than their fair share. I guess it depends on how you define fair share, but the top 20% of earners in Canada pay something like 2/3 or almost 2/3 of all income taxes. The bottom 20% of earners in Canada pay less than 1% of income taxes. So, you know, and you could continue to raise money by taxing the rich, but the problem with that is that eventually the rich are going to take their money and go. So you're discouraging investment, you're discouraging investment, and you're discouraging the creation of jobs. So it's a catch-22. And look, this isn't a conservative versus liberal thing. It's not right-wing versus left-wing. It's just simple economics. It's simple math, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot escape reality. You can't. You could pretend, but eventually it catches up to you. And as I said, last point I want to make that pertains specifically to healthcare in Canada, and that is that for the first time, we are now paying more to service our debt than we're paying for healthcare. Just let that sink in for a moment. If we had been fiscally responsible all these years and had not been accumulated in debt, we would be able to more than double our healthcare payments, the money that we put into healthcare today. That's how much money is being tied up right now in unproductive interest payments on our debt. Which brings me to the next topic. And by the way, again, I want to emphasize that is eventually where you end up with these big national programs. And by national programs, I'm not a libertarian, I'm a conservative. I think there's a role for government to play in providing a social safety net and providing some sort of income support to people who need that support. 100%, I don't have a problem with that. It's when the government takes over the provision of services that could be just as easily and more effectively and more efficiently provided by the private sector. So there's no reason for government to be running healthcare in Canada. Everybody could have access to healthcare, and if we have to come up with a way of providing some public assistance through government to those who have less means to pay for required healthcare services, then so be it. Providing some income support isn't the same thing as providing the service. I don't object to providing income support. I object to providing the service under the illusion that you have to provide the service as an alternative to providing income support. I think that's a nonsensical argument. We don't have to provide daycare. We could provide income support for low-income earners who require that support in order to afford to pay for daycare in the circumstances when they may have to access it. But there's no reason why the government has to provide that daycare. And eventually, that's what's going to happen, because eventually, as costs continue to escalate, because you're creating this demand. So the only way that you're going to be able to control those costs ultimately, as I said, capping them, and as with the example of healthcare in Canada, eventually you're just going to take over the whole system because you're operating under the illusion that that's the only way you can control the costs is by controlling the service. So you start out providing the service as a means of ensuring that people have access to it, but eventually you end up providing the service as a means of ensuring that people don't have unlimited access to it. And that is, I don't know if anyone's actually called that something, but let's call that the Ben-Ami rule. Okay? We'll call that the Ben-Ami rule. That government-run programs, when government's providing social services directly through government employees, through government agencies, that you start off with the idea that you're providing these services to help people, but eventually, because of the cost constraints, because of the escalating cost, because of the lack of any kind of market discipline on the whole process, you end up controlling the market not to ensure that services are provided, but to ensure that services are controlled and rationed in order to meet the fiscal realities of providing that service in the first place. That's a rule. And that's the principle that, I think that we all need to talk about and be aware of. It's not just Canada. This applies everywhere at all times. And again, there's only so much tax that you can wring out of the economy. Now, what a lot of countries are doing, we here in Canada for sure, but other countries as well, is they've discovered this principle, this idea of deficit financing. Well, we can do this and run a deficit. So essentially what we're doing is we're accumulating debt to pay for the services that we're providing today. Well, that also raises some very disturbing questions about the nature of our democratic institutions and our commitment to democratic principles. Let's remember, ladies and gentlemen, what makes us a democratic country isn't so much the electoral process, whatever shape that takes. That's an important element of a democratic parliamentary democracy, but it's not the essence. It's the mechanism. That's the mechanism whereby we control government, ostensibly anyway. The main principle, the question is, what exactly do our elected representatives do? And that is that they have the power of the purse. And the fundamental principle of parliamentary democracy is no taxation without representation. That's the fundamental principle. That the executive branch of government, whether it's elected or not elected or a monarchy or whatever the form of the executive branch of government, cannot confiscate the property and cannot tax the people without their consent. That is when you boil it all down. But you have to be able to elect your representatives, and your representatives who were elected by you have to approve of the taxation in order for it to be by consent. If you haven't been born yet, there's no way that you can exercise that kind of control. You're not voting for your representative, and therefore the idea of no taxation without representation simply doesn't apply to you because you have no capability of participating in the electoral process because you're either too young or haven't even been born yet. What does this have to do with deficit financing? Well, deficit financing, all public debt, is really just deferred taxation. It's really just a decision on the part of the people to defer paying for their consumption, for today's consumption. I can't afford this program today, but I'm going to continue to indulge my consumption of whatever the services are, and it's okay for me to do that because, well, we can always pay for it at some future date. And in the final analysis, that future date may be sometime when I won't even be around. So by leaving future generations with debt to pay, that is a violation of the fundamental principle, a profound violation of the fundamental principle of no taxation without representation. And therefore, it is a denial of our commitment to parliamentary democracy. And that applies irrespective of what country you're tuning into this show from. If your government, wherever you are, whether you're in America or the UK, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, wherever you are, if your government indulges in deficit financing that is chronic, I'm not talking about the vicissitudes of budgeting, where 1 year you might go over budget, 1 year you're going to go under budget, 1 year or 2 years you might run a small deficit, then you'll run a small surplus, but the general trend is for a balanced budget. I'm not talking about never having a deficit. I'm not talking about never having a surplus. I'm talking about always having a deficit. And by the way, for you financial-minded people out there, the question is, how can you sustain this ongoing debt? And the answer is through targeted inflation. We in Canada the government has an agreement with the Bank of Canada for a target inflation rate of 2% per annum. Which basically means it's our government policy to reduce the buying power of the dollar by 2% a year, which translates into 10% every 5 years, or 20% every 10 years. And so how they get away with the chronic deficit financing is by paying those debts in devalued dollars. It's a bit of a scam, and it's awful. It's a hidden tax on savings, because if you put your money in the bank, and in this day and age, if you put your money into an interest-bearing account, well, you're lucky if you're getting 0.5% interest. But your money is being devalued as a matter of government policy here in Canada by somewhere in the order of 2% per year. So when you put your money in the bank, you're actually losing money because you're losing the purchasing power of that, of those deposits, of those savings. And here's the irony in this, or irony, the tragedy, if you will, or shall I even say the crime of it, is you go to the bank and you buy a mutual fund, a GIC, and a GIC might pay you, I don't know, 1%, 1.5%, 1.75% per year. But if the government has a targeted inflation rate of 2%, really what you're doing is, by purchasing that GIC, you're losing money. Because you're going to be paid back, yes, with interest, but the value of the dollar that you're going to be paid back with interest is going to be that much less as a matter of government policy. It's outrageous when you think about it, but that's the way the government operates. And so theoretically, they can sustain a relatively modest chronic deficit because they're constantly paying the borrowed money back in devalued dollars. So that's how you can get away with it. But you can only get away with it if interest rates stay low. You can only get away with it if you don't face emergency situations like the pandemic. Whatever your opinion was about the justification for the measures that were taken in response to the COVID pandemic, there's no question that it was treated as a national emergency, and the government had to spend here in Canada hundreds of millions of dollars paying for the subsidies and the income support and the programs that it instituted in response to this alleged emergency. So whether it was a real emergency or not is completely beside the point. The only point that matters here is that it was deemed to be an emergency, and so we had to respond the way the government had to respond, the way it felt necessary to respond. And it added hundreds of millions of dollars to our debt here federally in Canada. So you don't, by running a chronic deficit, even if you can sustain it for almost indefinitely, because it's very modest, you leave yourself no room to respond to emergencies and then recover financially from that emergency later on. And that's the situation that we find ourselves here in Canada. And I suspect that that's the situation that many of you will find within your own governments. So when I talk about these issues, I'm not talking about them strictly from a Canadian point of view. I'm using the Canadian example to illustrate a problem that exists in many countries. And as I said, one of them is the idea that government can provide directly through government agencies owned and operated social services like healthcare, like daycare, like dental care. And on the subject of dental care, it's important to note that even though we allocated a certain amount of money for this new dental care program, and then no sooner had we implemented the program or started to implement the program, that critics were already saying we don't have anywhere near enough money to be able to provide adequate dental care for the people that we want to provide it for. So already, even though, we're only just coming out of the gate on this new massive government program, we're already talking about the fact that it's seriously underfunded. And so at some point in time in the not too distant future, we're going to have to, again, find ways to increase the funding to it, or we're going to have to cut back on the service that we're providing. What's the answer? Well, there are going to be government bureaucrats, I guarantee you, who are going to say, well, the only way that we're going to be able to keep this under control and ensure that the services we want to provide are available to every Canadian out there, which again is a noble goal, but they're going to say the only way we can do this and keep it under control is by nationalizing our dental care program in a manner that is not unlike the way we gradually nationalized healthcare in Canada. And that's the way it's going to be with dental care. That's the way it's inevitably going to be with daycare. That's the way inevitably it's going to be with pharmacare, and that is the way inevitably it's going to be with school lunch programs. Of course, we've already nationalized the education system. And again, same problems. We can't improve the system, but we can't reduce the costs of the system either. So these are the ongoing chronic problems. And again, I cannot say this enough, ladies and gentlemen, if your government is running these chronic deficits, like we do in Canada, and like you do in the United States, grotesquely so, remember, it's really a mistake to talk about that subject in terms of public debt, national debt. Our debt is such and such. We have a debt clock. Our deficit. These are financial terms that, as accurate as they are, they don't capture the real essence of the principal problem with deficit financing and accumulating large public debt. The principal problem with it is that it, as I said before, it violates the fundamental principle of parliamentary democracy, and that is no taxation without representation, because it is deferred taxation, and that's the proper way to refer to it. We are not running a $40 billion deficit in Canada today. This budget does not include a $40 billion deficit. This budget defers taxation in the order of $40 billion to some future date. That's the proper way to look at it. And by referring to it as deferred taxation, we're forcing ourselves to come to terms, to face the reality that it's our children and our grandchildren and perhaps even our great-grandchildren who are going to be paying for the consumption of services that we are indulging in today. That is breaking trust with future generations, ladies and gentlemen. And it's undermining the democratic principles on which our nations were built, our countries were built. Sound finance in government, sound money, proper, responsible fiscal policy is essential to the democratic experience, to the democratic experiment. If we can't get this right, ladies and gentlemen, what are we even trying to do? All right. Again, watching the clock. What else is there to talk about? There's so many things. See, we did a great job, didn't we, tonight? We did not spend time talking about the Middle East. And if you didn't catch last week's show, I really recommend you go back the second part of the show, and you can catch it on our podcast at the website www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. Go to the podcast library page and catch last week's podcast. You won't be disappointed. It really sheds light on some of the things that are going on in the Middle East, not just the Gaza conflict, but in particular, what you'll be interested in is the financing and activities of UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Works Agency for Palestinians. Very interesting and very disturbing stuff. So we didn't talk about any of this stuff this week, and I'm glad we didn't, because everybody else is covering it. And I thought that it was appropriate to cover some of these other things that the mainstream media really isn't paying very close attention to, at least not in the fashion that I think it ought to be. So I'm glad we were able to avoid that. But again, I just want to recommend to you that you go back and take a look at that. Also, I haven't posted it yet, but I think I'm going to post a interview that I did on America Out Loud, the other side of the story is a show on America Out Loud, and they had me on last week as well. The podcast was posted, the broadcast was on Sunday and Monday night of this week, and the podcast is now online. And what I think I'm going to do is I'll provide you with a with a link to that so that you can listen to that particular interview. It was quite interesting, and it had everything to do with our favorite topic, climate change. So if you go to the website and it hasn't been posted yet, bear with me. Check back again in a few hours, and it will be. What else is there to talk about? As we head into the home stretch, the final couple of minutes of the show, is it possible that I'm running out of things to talk about? That's just not possible. What else is happening? When you go to the website, don't forget, I've already talked about the podcast library, but you can get the podcast of any of our previous shows right there on the website by scrolling down the player. We have all of our shows listed there. And what else can you get? You can read all of my columns, etc. And you can also sign up for our free email list. Costs you nothing. It's absolutely free. And we don't share any emails with anybody. That's my pledge to you, ladies and gentlemen. But that's one way to stay completely up to date with what's happening on the show. And we're going to have, probably before the end of this week, we will have reinstituted our recommended reading page. I don't know whether you know this or not, but the website actually was hacked about a month or so ago. So we had to reconstruct the website from scratch, and we haven't entirely repopulated it with everything that was there, but we're ready now to do the recommended reading feature. So if it's not up by the end of the week, check again on the weekend, because it should be up by then. Okay, well, we're coming to the end of the show, ladies and gentlemen, so I want to thank you for joining in, as always, and to say, God bless, and we will catch you next week here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.